just raining during that time. I mean, can you imagine living in a world where the people just rejoice because godly people get killed? And they're just laughing, and everybody's thinking they're dead, they're dead, they're dead. The wicked whatever that witch is dead, you know that story. They're lying in the streets for 3 days. I mean, they showed absolutely no respect to these guys. I mean, it's almost like the most disrespectful thing you could ever do is to leave 2 bodies lying probably in Jerusalem. All of a sudden, God says, it's time for me to do my thing. And he breathes life back into these 2 witnesses. And they stand up on their feet. Now, remember, the whole world's out there having a big party at this time, and the Antichrist thinks, he's won. Look at Revelation chapter 11. This is kind of so neat, what Jesus does here. It's kind of similar to what he did with Lazarus. But after the 3.5 days, the breath of life from God entered them, and they stood on their feet, so great fear fell on those who saw them. Then they, talking about those 2 witnesses, they heard a loud voice from heaven saying to them, come up here. They went up to heaven in a cloud while their enemies watched them. You know what that was? Another miniature rapture. That's what that was. And the whole world, I think ABC, NBC, CNN, Fox, all of them are watching this. It's live. It's just live. And all of a sudden, these guys just start floating up in the air. And folks, this just happened maybe 4 or 5 years ago to the whole church. They had every opportunity in the world to be saved. I mean, they've heard the gospel, as I just mentioned. The Bible says that during this time, unfortunately, a lot of the saints will be killed. Look at number 4. There will be defection in the tribulation. You'd like to think that, everybody be working together, but, when Satan gets involved in the lives of people, this kind of stuff happens. It says in Matthew 24, verse 10, then many will take offense, betray one another, hate one another. Many false prophets will rise up and deceive many, because lawlessness or crime will multiply. The love of many will grow cold, but the one who endures to the end will be delivered. Now here's the good news. The good news of the kingdom will be proclaimed in all the world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. During this time, and I know it's hard to try to imagine it can get any worse, but it says here that people start turning on each other. But you have to understand, they don't have God in their life anymore. And God's word's been removed. And there's nothing here. There are some that are hearing the gospel from the evangelists. Some of them are getting saved, but most people are just rejecting it with a hard heart. And the Bible says there's lawlessness. Folks, we think we've got crime, and we've got a real problem in Jacksonville with crime. But it's just like a microchip of what's to come in the Great Tribulation. Think about this. There will not be enough military. There will not be enough policemen. There will be no form of legality during that time. It'll be every man for himself. Think about that if you have a family living during the Great Tribulation. And then in Matthew 24, verse 14, it says, the good news of the kingdom will be proclaimed in all the world as a testimony to all nations. You know what that tells me? That before Jesus comes back, and we're going to talk about this next week, the gospel is shared to every nation, every tribe, every person has one last chance during the Great Tribulation. Nobody will be able to stay out there and say, I didn't know. God's grace is going to be in the midst of the Great Tribulation. I mean, it's just incredible. So some will be saved. Revelation chapter 7, verse 9, the reason I know a lot of people are saved during the Great Tribulation is this verse tells us that. It says, and as he looked, there was a vast multitude from every nation, tribe, people, and language, which no one could number. Look at this, standing before the throne, before the Lamb. John, in the book of Revelation, says, they're going to be people standing before the throne that were saved during the Great Tribulation from every tribe, every part of the world. Number 5, desolation in the tribulation. This is where really it all starts, the last 3.5 years, in my opinion. Daniel predicted this was going to happen. This is the Antichrist. Jesus talked about this. Jesus is quoting Daniel 2,500 years before. He says, "So when you see the abomination that is causes desolation, spoken of by the prophet Daniel, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand." Jesus said, here it is. You're asking for signs. Here's a big one. When the event that Daniel talked about 2,500 years ago takes place, you are in the last 3.5 years of the Great Tribulation. And the Bible says that's exactly what takes place in the book of Daniel. And I'm not going to go through that 1 week covenant. There's a whole lot of stuff there about 70 weeks, and it's just really kind of deep stuff. But basically, Daniel said there's going to be 7 years. That 1 week covenant speaks of a 7-year period. 3.5 years into that peace treaty, he's going to do something that nobody saw coming. Because at that point, he has tried to get the whole world to follow him. He's had the false prophet on his side. He's got religion. He's got an economy. He's got currency. And there's a peace treaty signed with Israel. I mean, he is the guy. He's, the man of the year. He's the guy that's on Time magazine. Everybody's worshiping this guy. And then he does something that nobody saw coming. He goes to Jerusalem, and this is hard to understand, but folks, when at some point in time the Jews rebuild the temple in Jerusalem, they're having their worship. They're back to their old ways, so to speak. And the Bible says the Antichrist walks into this holy place. It is the temple. And basically what he does is he takes off this mask of the Antichrist, of trying to be this peace guy and all this stuff, and he reveals himself for who he is. And he says, it's time for you to worship me. I'm God. So he's been playing games for about 3.5 years, with the world. But when he does this is the act that you're in the last 3.5 years of time as we know it on this earth. And then Revelation 13, it talks about this. It talks about this 3.5 months and where he's going to come forth. And it says in verse 6, he's going to speak blasphemies against God, to blaspheme his name, his dwelling, and he's going to talk about those of us who are in heaven. He's going to call us, and he's going to be permitted, look at this, to wage war against the saints and conquer them. He was also given authority over every tribe, people, and language. This is where it all really starts, the last 3.5 years, when he walks into the temple and he says, the world is mine, and nobody can take it away from me. And he breaks his promises. And he says, now you worship me. And that's what Satan has always wanted, isn't it? Remember when we talked about his fall? The very thing that he coveted the most when he was an angel in heaven was God's glory. And that's what he wants. And that's what he demands through this Antichrist. Well, here's the last thing. Jesus talks about the distress. And notice what he says. Then those in Judea must flee the mountains. A man on the housetop must not come down to get the things of his house. A man in the field must not go back to get his clothes. Woe to a pregnant woman nursing mothers to those days. Let me tell you what happens. Jesus says when all this happens, especially this desolation in the temple, he says, if you are a Jew living in Jerusalem, you are to run for the mountains because all hell is about to break loose. It talks about if you're working in the field, don't you come home and even exchange your clothes. If you're working on the roof repairing the shingle, don't you even think about going in the house and getting your wallet. If you're a pregnant mother, this is going to be so difficult because you're going to have to run, and it's so difficult to run when you're pregnant. Pray that it's not winter. Pray that it's not on the Sabbath because you have to get out of Jerusalem now. Because I am about to let this Antichrist just open up the gate, and all hell is going to break loose on this earth. Folks, this is hard for us to understand because some of us who have been raised in church, we know God is a God of love and a God of mercy, but he is a God of justice. And he said one day he would pour it out, and he's doing it. And some of us have even been thinking, God, why have you been waiting so long? Why don't you just go ahead and do it now? Because he's just the God of grace. But right now, his wrath is coming out. And the Bible says, look at this verse.